And I think I'm recording, so hopefully I am. So my recorded lecture, or the first one for this evening, is going to be reading in particular Brokeback Mountain and Call Me By Your Name through David Halperin's essay on heroes and their pals found in 100 Years of Homosexuality. I'll go over some of the structures of the essay itself and some of its central ideas for sure, but my goal is really to allow us to think about the two films that we deal with this term that deal exclusively with masculine desire. Halperin, of course, wins me over, and part of my selection of this essay is my experience working on the Edwardians. And he begins this essay with a quote from one of my favorite writers ever, and I shall read. I wish we were labeled, remarks Ricky Elliott, the hero of E.M. Forster's The Longest Journey, 1907, to his best friend at Cambridge. The novelist adds, he wished that all the confidence and mutual knowledge that is born in such a place as Cambridge could be organized. For man is so made that he cannot remember long without a symbol. He wished there was a society, a kind of friendship office, where the marriage of true minds could be registered. Think about those words. Think about what Ricky Elliott tells us. Think about what he actually says in 1907. And then we can also think about our the rights many couples have in response to marriage that we have today. Halperin asks us to go back in time to Homer's Iliad, to the Hebraic Bible, and as well to the story of Gilgamesh, to look at the ways that we can not double read, but effectively read the relationship between the hero and his beloved, his significant other. Moving back in time, Halperin normalizes what I think society still doesn't. He explains through these detailed evaluations in the chapter I had you read that there's a symbolic dimension. In other words, he relies on Forster's words. I'm on page 76 of my version, in the role of purveying the means of collective self-understanding that constitutes social labels. And I think this is an interesting twist to what we think about when we think about social labels, and the way all of us, myself included, try and find ways to break free of particular labels, or to have a label that allows us to truly be who we want to be. On page 76, there's direct reference to the Gilgamesh epic and the books of Samuel, and the ways that in which these narratives reveal that friendship did not always play a central role in the narrative, but only in the final editorial version. And when I was choosing essays for this cinema class, I thought about the way we speak about the editorial process of films, and think about what could start in the beginning and move forward and be switched and developed and intensified through the end. There's a movement away from what Halperin understands as traditional material, and the way that friendship is constructed. And you'll remember my earlier point in cross-referencing the story that Elio's mom reads to him about the French knight, and it translated into German using Freundschaft, the notion that before we had words to express the way same-sex couples might have loved one another, the word friendship could have been a kind of coded language. It certainly was, or the word friend. And if you do read E.M. Forster's Morris, you'll notice that the word friend is used to replace a word we might use, such as partner, lover, significant other. Halperin's goal, as stated on page 77, is to do a comparative study, right? So another Brian point, on the common set of structures which serve to organize the basic elements that constitute each friendship. In other words, he isolates the pair, in his words, in each of the myths, stories, fables, to get us to see that these two people are always male, there's no rivals, There's no other couples and no relationships with women. In other words, what Halperin understands is distracting. That's, Halperin uses the word distracting. Think about the way Ennis and Jack are partially distracted from their own desires based on the compulsory heterosexuality that they live, as we had talked about in Brokeback Mountain. There also seems to be a privilege of maleness that permeates these three stories, where friendship is something only that men can have and share with one another. And as I can get a little political when I read things, I urge you to think about the Island of Women Warriors in Wonder Woman. There are all kinds of narratives that express desire in a different way. So in this one, Halperin's asking us to look at relationships between men where the principal couple is only male, and a way to think about this in response to what he understands as privatizing their love. In other words, not so much creating a secret code, but moving from the realm of public life into private life. And we will see that in Call Me By Your Name. Both characters are placed into almost a magical setting, a magical castle of sorts, where in the Italian landscape, a reconstruction of a pastoral that nurtures the lover gives them the private space they need to develop their relationship. Halperin explains that these kinds of environments, and I'm at the bottom of 77, are understood as micropolitics. There's a structural symmetry in the organization, but there is also the question of the lover who might be subordinated. In other words, he's understood as the other, either socially or through the narratology in question. There's usually one lover who has greater prowess and greater strength, and one lover who is understood, in Halperin's words on page 78, as superior. Halperin explains that from this, there is also an asymmetry. In other words, something that moves off of an organized symmetrical path. And it's from here that we can question the kinds of heroic friendships, that they're not merely didactic and hierarchical. They actually have a deeper, more not necessarily nuanced, but a more compassionate way for us to read them. What happens, and we certainly see this in Brokeback Mountain, is the less favored lover dies. And that's kind of interesting. We can debate who is less favored and more favored in said film, but we can do that in a moment. Death is often seen as the climax of these kinds of heroic friendships. We can understand this rather obviously in Brokeback through the unfortunate death of Jack Twist, but at the end of Call Me By Your Name, the lovers part. So there is a death with the physicality that connects them. Why is there this sadness? Why must there be death? Do they come from these archetypes? Is this the kind of psychic mimesis that Lacan taught us about earlier in the term, that if we keep almost imagining or thinking of the way that particular relationships need to be articulated, are we always going to see the same ending? Two questions remain on page 79. The meaning attached to friendship in the three different texts that he looks at, and which friendship is constructed. Halperin starts with the Gilgamesh epic, and he explains that Gilgamesh is a figure who is larger than life. He has the ability to slay the monster. We'll see this in other narratives as well. And this power gives him this almost meta-sexual presence, where he is thus othered by this power. In other words, he isn't the same as other males. He has the ability to be more. He has a certain level of pride and contentment from his achievements within this world and what Halperin understands as civilized life. Enkidu's friendship, and I quote on page 80, the last paragraph, plays several complementary roles in the larger dramatic design of the epic. So think about the way that the lovers in our films that we're looking at complement one another. We had talked about this before, and I don't think I had a chance to finish it, but looking at the age difference in Call Me by Your Name, we instantly presume that Oliver is the predatorial partner. Only when we actually screen the film slowly do we realize it's really Elio who makes the first jump, as we did discuss and had a good laugh about. So on page 81, sorry, Halperin makes reference to the kinds of pleasure that Gilgamesh takes in Enkidu's company. And this anticipates and underwrites the positionality associated to wives, and that their existence has the ability to transcend the everyday. In other words, what would have been the compulsory heterosexuality of the time. That Gilgamesh seeks out the pleasure of human companionship. And this is something that he can only experience with kin. So this is an interesting word as well, which we'll talk about the idea of someone's cousin. We see this in Romeo and Juliet and in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as well. So in Shakespeare and in Victorian literature, where the questionable male character is always with their kinsman, quoting the word, or their cousin. What does this mean? What does this closeness of bond mean? And we can think of the notion of blood brothers for sure. And then this brotherhood, which is developed on page 81, reveals that the characters become the object of sexual desire. They move, they transgress spaces. In the Gilgamesh epic, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh mourns him like a widow. We realize the power of their love and the power of their relationship. And we can think of Anis Delmar's little shrine he puts up to Jack with the postcard of Brokeback and the two shirts, one inside one another, and the ending of the film where Anis Delmar is in tears and says, Jack, I swear. And then the film ends. We realize the power of mourning and the power of sadness. On page 82, we enter into the two differences in the Hebraic text, an earlier one and a later one, in the relationship between David and Jonathan. So David is King Saul's son. In other words, he's the uncrowned king to come. And there's an invisible transfer of royal authority that would happen from Saul to David. So his rule within his society would have been very, very important, with a lot of the pressures that we certainly see that come from what Butler understands as the heterosexual matrix. But this story thwarts it. It doesn't quite reject it, but it pushes it aside, because Jonathan falls in love with David and changes David's mind. There's a transfer of roles that are previously played, and Saul's daughter, who we would presume would marry or be the object or subject of desire, is transferred to Saul's son. And it's from here there's an emphasis from conjugal love on page 83 in the first paragraph to friendship. And there seems to be what Halperin understands as a substitution for friendship, for conjugal love. And this almost surpasses the love of women. In other words, there's marriage and women on one plane, and then these epics reveal to us another plane of going, where David even enunciates my brother Jonathan, and we realize that this fraternal relationship is that blurred line between the fraternal and the conjugal. We might see that in Call Me by Your Name. There was definitely, I think, representations of brotherly love in Brokeback Mountain. We'll see how you all feel about that when we're done with the next screening. The friendship that we have in David and Jonathan at the bottom of page 84 is basically turned into an image, an ideal of how we might or might not understand male-male relationships. And they reveal the larger bonds of human sociality. So it's here that Halperin normalizes this relationship between men, that if human beings are social, then men are presumed to connect and interact, and what they experience is simply part of the larger spectrum. Friendship, so I'll quote from Halperin, the second paragraph on page 84. We find that the friendship is parasitic in its conceptualization on kinship relations and on sexual relations. In other words, that it must borrow terminology and imagery from these other spheres of human relations in order to identify and define itself. And we'll see if we see this, which we will, of course, in our film adaptations, that from these epics to written versions, to screenplays, to film, we end up with this repetition, this mimetic structure that shows us a particular set of semiotics that have us read what we appear to be familiarized with. And the end product is always stronger every time it's redone. From here, we move on to the stories of Achilles and Patroclus. Patroclus, yeah, I pronounced it right. Sorry, that should have been better rehearsed, right? I should have paused that. I don't think I'm going to get a call back for that one. And there's an analogy to kinship, which is in the Iliad, that it surpasses a particular intensity that we associate with what would have been the heteronormative of the time. On page 85, there's the desire for Achilles to be buried with Patroclus. And we can think about the ways that this kind of love and the intensity attached to it has been articulated since ancient and biblical times. The central friendship, so we are on 85, the second paragraph that are part of these narratives reveal the need for human solidarity. These are Halperin's words. Think about the innate humanness and the need to connect with someone on a deep level, both kinship and conjugally. So these things are part of who we are. And we might think of the way that Jack and Ennis, well, Ennis more so than Jack, reject these possibilities. They don't exist within the sphere of his understanding. And we'll be able to see if Elio and Oliver do a better job with this. Halperin explains that this is the play that exists with male subjectivity, and I'll have you look at Kaya Silverman's essay later on in the term, and we'll have a look at how male subjectivity is marginalized and think about that as well with other films. The erotics of male comradeship come to occupy a more prominent place in the collective imagination. And this is what I really wanted to draw attention to, the collective imagination, heroic friendship, to use Halperin's terms, and think about the way that heroic friendships can displace all of the other areas of connecting, at least according to Halperin. We have the movement from kinship to brotherhood to the question of conjugal relationships, an entire displacement, as Halperin explains on the top of 86. And then it's curious, I find there's a digression in the last two paragraphs where there's the desire, based on what Halperin makes reference to, for the Greeks to have figured out who plays which role in the relationship. I don't think this should matter. In other words, we shouldn't be examining relationships and how we kind of dehumanize them by understanding rules into reductive gender categories or sexual acts. The reality is the lovers in all three texts have an intensity in the way that they feel about one another. The advantages to the texts is that they show us these beautiful friendships between men. But the disadvantages is that they also inscribe that death is part of the paradigm that's set up for us to examine male-male friendship. In other words, for whatever reason, it can transgress time. And we could look at Ovid's Metamorphoses as well and think about Apollo's botched love of affair with Hyacinth, who dies when they're discus playing. They're playing a sport together, and the discus kills him. It's an awful part of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Halperin tells us that these, on the top of 87, that the difficulties, in other words, with some of the stuffs I've mentioned, remain instructive for all of us. And we should be able to focus on the shifts in the articulation of social and sexual categories. This is really our goal as we examine the kinds of films we examine, because we want to escape, and I'll quote Halperin again, the critical grasp of the very interpretive communities responsible for canonizing them. In other words, we need to be able to push beyond a death narrative or an isolation narrative or a sadness narrative. Halperin urges us to use a sharper focus when we look at these stories, and hopefully the films that we'll look at as well. And he suggests that if we look at the stories he makes reference to and the films that we'll look at, we end up with the ability to, quote, interpret the erotics of friendship. And he ends this essay or this chapter by saying, and I'll read for you, find where the last sentence starts. There we go. And then modern inquiries into homosexuality in Homer, like classical Greek inquiries into the respective erotic roles of Achilles and Patroclus, so he does tell us why he has gone there, may prove at last to be genuinely enlightening, not for what they reveal about the ancient heroes, but for what they tell us about those shadowy folk whom the heroes themselves simply describe as, quote, those who are yet to be, end quote. So he ends this essay by letting us know that those who could not honor these heroes, the shadowy folks, are not there yet. They haven't yet arrived. Thank you for listening.